I am really, really delighted to introduce Barbara J. Hunt this week, forgiveness specialist, coach, workshop, retreat leader, author, musician, bit of everything. She has been studying and working in the self-development space for more than 25 years through many different avenues and schools, I believe, including Buddhist and Sufi traditions as well. And I'm very, very excited to talk to her today about forgiveness, getting to the heart of what it really means to forgive, how we can push through some of the barriers we may face with forgiveness. So Barbara, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, David. Thanks.
So I wonder if you could start us off by introducing yourself. Obviously, I mentioned something there, but I don't like putting people into just a box. So, if you could start by just introducing yourself, tell us a bit more about your journey and how you got to where you are now.
Sure. Well, I grew up in a Catholic faith, in a practicing Catholic family. And so there was always a spirituality in our, in the environment I grew up in. But also I think I was interested in the deeper questions of life. And I don't quite know what prompted that. Maybe the people that I was with, one of the friends I knew was reading Richard Bach's book, Jonathan Livingston Seagull, which asked some very deep questions. And I encountered that when I was about 15 years old. And I think I was ever since then really have been curious about the really big questions: why we're here, what is life about, what really matters. And so my encounter, particularly with forgiveness, I think the relevant part to my story is when I went to a personal development course in 1992, and I was learning about forgiveness, and they invited us to write down all the people that we thought we might be holding some kind of grudge against or resentment. And I just thought, well, probably everyone I've ever met, probably. So I started my list and wrote down, the usual suspects. And I got to number 36 and I thought, I probably resent my mum as well. And the interesting thing about my mum is that my mum had multiple sclerosis. And by the time I was 15, it was significantly affecting the family. And then as I got older, by the time I was 18, she was in a wheelchair. I was wheeling her around. By the time I was 20, I left university to come back home to look after her and take care of my family. And so the important thing I think about my forgiveness story is that it was forgiving something that is hard to even admit that you were resenting someone for. And there's often big exemplars of forgiveness, people who forgive really heinous crimes and difficult challenges. And we don't often talk about the daily grind of things that we need to forgive, but we also don't talk about the secret things that we harbor resentments against, like someone being ill in your family and the massive impact that has on you and your whole family. And so that was a real revelation for me. And it gave me permission to admit that I had been resenting her for being ill, and to be able to do my forgiveness work on her really did change our relationship, because there was a barrier, the barrier of resentment that had shut down. And also I think the other thing about forgiveness is it's a complex subject, and there's some really beautiful quotes about forgiveness. One of which is Eva Kaur, I think it is, or actually there's another. No, Edith Eger, who's a Holocaust survivor, and she says that forgiveness is about grief, which I think is really important, that we allow ourselves to include the grieving part in our forgiveness practice. So that's really, so my interest in forgiveness sort of began then. I was interested in how this particular organization taught forgiveness. I agreed with some of it, but not all of it. I encountered other trainings about forgiveness, and there's lots of, in the spiritual field, there's a particular kind of forgiveness which I would count as a spiritual bypass. So where you're required to take such a deep breath in and overlook so high that you're missing out the little animal body of you that was traumatized or hurt or the victim of something. And so what I've tried to do as I've developed my process is to not only find out what works. So I've used quite a lot of my clients as guinea pigs, as in, what really works, what helps to actually truly let go, but also investigating what do other forgiveness teachers recommend and what's the best practice. And so what I've tried to create is something where you don't have to be spiritual to be able to forgive. But if you are, then it's you know that it's a master spiritual practice. Forgiveness, I think, next to meditation, those two practices are the master practices. But also my other main thrust of my fascination was, if forgiveness is so amazing, why don't we? Why aren't we all forgiving everybody all the time? Why is the world, especially at the moment, so full of division and, resentment, really? That's what the exchanges on Twitter and the social media feeds are, basically resentment, being.
Yeah, and then it just expands, doesn't it? Somebody puts out some resentment out there and somebody else gets angry about it. And, I think a virus spreads fast, but, mental afflictions like that spread across the world in an instant.
Yeah, I think
between so many different communities.
Yeah, resentment really is the virus we need to be really paying attention to, because it's rife. It's in everything. It's in our culture in a way that we don't realize. I was reading a Ken Wilber book, and he was saying that when we learn our language, the language of our own native tongue, we don't know that we're also learning the grammar for that language. We take it for granted. But if somebody asked you, what are the grammar rules for your particular language, you won't know. And our culture's like that. The numbers of incidences of people resenting somebody and justifying their behavior. If you think about like all the soap operas, EastEnders, and it's all about resentment. Many of our movies are all about resentment. Most divorces are about resentment. So yeah. Yeah,
and I think it's almost regarded as normal, as the right way to act, is to get revenge or get back at someone, to allow that to fester.
You don't want to be like the worst and just let people walk all over you. It's like there's kind of the wagging finger. Like you don't let that happen. You stand up. But and actually, interestingly, I'm really clear about in my forgiveness work that we're not talking about letting someone get away with something. You don't have to resent someone while you're divorcing them. You can do the conscious uncoupling. You can do it with love. You can see that the relationship is over, but you want to take care of the kids, or it's like hate is the optional thing. And sometimes when people get really stuck with what do I do in this circumstance, is to really turn it around and just say, well, is my hate helping?
Yeah, I often talk about similar kind of things. Really, it's about that protection for ourselves and our relationships, isn't it? If you get into you're driving down the motorway and your car breaks, just because that you accept that that's the situation you're in, and you have a sort of a patient acceptance, and you're not angry, doesn't mean you don't fix the car. Of course, you still fix the car. So you can still sort out external problem, but the internal problem needs an internal solution, doesn't it? I often see that people think that if you're going to be patient, or if you're going to be forgiving, or not get angry, that means I'll be a pushover, and everybody will get away with everything. But it's definitely not about that.
Yeah.
I'd like at this point, just before we delve into it a bit more, I'd like you to define forgiveness. How do you define forgiveness?
This is very important, actually, because I think it's one of those words that we think we kind of know what it means, but we often don't. So funnily enough, I have two definitions. I have the one that I use in the book, which is, and this is from K. Bradford Brown. So he created the More to Life program, which is a really excellent personal and spiritual development course, and they have lots of different courses. They're still going, and it's very helpful introduction to forgiveness. And he said, forgiveness is the absolute refusal to hold ill will against someone or something for what they did or didn't do. And I really like it. So I'm going to say it again, because there's lots of different parts to it. So the absolute refusal to hold ill will against someone for what they did or didn't do. And I really like it, because it really gives that sense of, I am the one who is choosing to hold the ill will. And we don't realize, I think that's one of there are several obstacles in my book. I write about 5 different obstacles. But it's almost like before you get to the obstacles, the main obstacle is not even knowing or admitting that you're holding the resentment in the first place. And we're not tuned in to that sensibility at the moment. Culturally, we're not. Like you said, the culture is you hold firm and you just don't let anyone get away with anything. You write back if they, there's no sense of forgiveness is the ideal here. But that's the definition I use in the book, because it's a very clear thing. It's about, I'm not holding on. If you imagine, like, you kind of collect up the resentment over the years, the things that people do, and they keep doing things, and so you end up with this kind of like huge collection of stuff that like is your ill will that you're holding, and you're nurturing it really most of the time, and kind of going over it and just, they did do that, and you're kind of like collecting up this whole I don't know, catalogue of grievances that the other person has done, particularly if you're in a long-term relationship. And the absolute refusal just means that I'm putting it down. So I'm going free. I'm not holding it. It doesn't mean that it didn't happen. Yeah, it happened, but I'm not carrying it around with me. So I go free. And that's why I really like Hip Rapper Brown's definition, because he talks about the absolute refusal. So there's no, am I kind of sort of resenting somebody? It's like being pregnant. You either are or you aren't, or you haven't done your test yet. So this is I go free by not holding the resentment. But also the other more sort of meta version of forgiveness, which is more really the outcome of forgiveness that I use, which is coming to a sense of peace, release, and reconciliation inside yourself about something or someone. And I really like that one too, because because that's the, like you were saying, it's the internal experience. It's about your heart. I always think forgiveness is about spring cleaning your own heart. And it's letting go of the stuff that builds up in there, and things build up. I mean, if we're just honest about it, people are not always doing the things we want them to do. And so therefore, that's where you get a little grievance. The minute someone is not doing what you want, that's it. But a little grievance.
Yeah. I really like those two. I think you can see quite clearly in the two of them, the thread that's there is that it's wholehearted, right? It's with your entire being. It's not something you pay lip service to, I forgive you. But it's something that comes from within. And like you said, that second definition, that the peace that comes from wholeheartedly forgiving, not sort of just paying lip service to it.
Yeah.
I often, just to touch upon what you were just saying there, actually, I often talk about this concept of attachment and aversion, in Buddhism, and, this way of viewing people and other things through these filters, So we see in the case of attachment, somebody as a source of our happiness or our pleasure. So they bring us, this pleasure, they bring us this joy, and then we start to expect that from them, don't we? It's almost like their duty, keep providing us with pleasure, with happiness, and we put that expectation out there. And then the moment that it's out there, they have to be this way, not that way. It has to go perfectly. For one, I think we're giving away, our happiness to others, to what happens outside of us. But secondly, I think we're probably setting ourselves up for disappointment, frustration, right? So it's almost, in a way, I guess, one of the precursors to the blame, the grudge, the holding on to what should have been, which then needs to be forgiven. Does that make sense? What do you think?
Totally, yes. Today's expectations are tomorrow's resentments. Yeah, like and I think as soon as anything diverges, this is how like reality is, and this is, then sometimes it goes a different way, and you want it to be the way you want it to be, and as soon as it's different, as soon as someone else is different, if you were different, I'd be happy. There's, the minute things are diverging from the way we think, or our predicting brains are telling us they should be, then we get some kind of disgruntlement, and we part ways with reality. And that's why the second definition about being at peace and reconciliation is, yes, this did happen. That person did do that. They did say that. That did happen to me when I was a child. It's about really coming back to the reality of it, rather than, but it shouldn't have happened. My parents shouldn't have sent me to boarding school. They shouldn't have moved house when I was 6. It's like that kind of, the things that we, wherever we're diverging from the reality. So the part of the forgiveness, like I was saying earlier, about part of it being about grieving, is you really acknowledge, I wanted it to be different and it wasn't. And then you can come back to that place of peace. Yeah.
And I guess part of that is about accepting that, yes, this did happen. And no matter how I feel about it now, whether, it's worrying or mumbling, grumbling, whatever it is, it won't change what actually happened.
No.
I was listening yesterday to an interview you gave. I think it's one that's on your website. And one of the things you mentioned that you found particularly fascinating, and I think was actually the angle you first took with your book, Forgiveness Made Easy, was the reasons why people find forgiveness difficult. Mm-hmm. And then I was having a look in your book, and right towards the start, you mentioned what you just mentioned earlier, that there's these 5 main obstacles to forgiveness. So I wonder if you could unpack these a little bit for us. Why do you think so many find it difficult to forgive when they feel they have been wronged?
Yeah. No, I'd be very happy to do that. And bearing in mind, there's that first meta, reason why we don't forgive, which is we don't even realize we need to.
Yeah, we need to,
or that we're holding on to resentment. So the first one is having a definition that works, because I think it's really important to know what forgiveness is. I don't know if you were ever aware of what was happening on the BBC. There was a little program which was about forgiveness, where listeners would phone in like a story, and then the panel and then the British public would judge whether or not it was forgivable or not. And I wrote into them very many times, and they never answered me.
Oh,
because I was just thinking they're training the British public, everything that is wrong about forgiveness. It's not to do with the crime. It's not to do, you can forgive these things, but not these things. Or, well, if they meant harm, very much like our judicial system, if someone means to create harm, then they get a heavier sentence than if it was in the heat of the moment, or it was an accident. So we have this sort of morality about intention. And so this sort of panel of people judging, and then the British public going, well, I wouldn't forgive him, and then other people go, well, I've done something similar to that, so I would, and it's this very random attitude towards forgiveness. So having a definition that you can really clearly use, so the one I use is the Cape Bradford Brown one, is that that you've let go of your forgiveness because my hands are free and empty. I've consciously made that decision. So that's the first one, is having a definition that works. The second one is about vulnerability, which you mentioned as well, is that we don't like to be vulnerable. It's terrifying to our egos, and although we're not often physically making ourselves in jeopardy, socially and emotionally we feel like we're risking something. And one of the great teachers, Brené Brown, who talks about vulnerability, I mean, she does it better than most people, so I don't have much to add to what she has to say, but it's a really important part of why we don't want to forgive, because we think it means giving the other person the advantage, or that we will make ourselves too open and therefore woundable. And the truth is, the root of the word vulnerable comes from the ability to vulner, which is to be wounded, which means we can be wounded, or the way we make meaning, we can be wounded. Because if you actually said, all the metaphors that we talk in, like my heart is broken, well, it's not actually broken. I mean, I know that there are physiological things that happen in your heart, like the octopus heart, when the things swell up and misshapen when you lose somebody. So there are physiological things that happen. But the truth of the vulnerability is very much in our meaning making and not in reality. And also the other thing about the vulnerability is we do need, like I said earlier, to admit that we've been hurt. And we do sometimes, that's what we want to avoid. We want to avoid really acknowledging, actually, that was a tough thing to go through. I really wished that hadn't happened. Like if you've ever had anybody who has been ill in your family, or an accident, or the loss of a pet, all those things, they're hard to bear. And so, but being vulnerable is something that we want to avoid. But actually the truth is if you let yourself feel those things, then they pass. I think it's our resistance to them that is hardest to counter.
Yeah.
So that's the second one. So having a definition. The second one is vulnerability. The third one is ego, which is, this is sort of, again, more invisible shenanigans that's going on, which is about positioning and, well, I don't think they should, there's, what our ego is making meaning about what the other person has done and what they haven't done. And there are some, because ultimately the real reason we don't want to forgive or find it hard is because we don't want to forgive.
Yeah. We want to feel superior and
exactly. So all of the ego's ruses, so being superior and having the moral high ground, and we can use it we can use the having the moral high ground as a reason, as an excuse, like, well, you can't expect me to do, to stand up in the world because I had this experience when I was young, or, we can use it, or, I'm justified in stealing the stationery at work because my boss is an idiot. It's like we can use our resentments for our own ends. And so all of those ego behaviors are quite entertaining and addictive, and usually unmentioned. But what I quite like is, with humor, is to talk about them, because then we can out ourselves, and then we can get to a bit more forgiveness in the world. So the third one is the ego. The fourth one is resentment. And so that's more about not recognizing it for what it is, not realizing the damage that it's doing. So on the other side of the ego getting all of its benefits, actually the downside to carrying resentment is massive. And you've probably heard those famous quotes like, resentment is like setting yourself on fire and expecting the other person to be bothered by the smoke, or drinking poison yourself. And I keep trying to find really good analogies for what forgiveness is like. And at the moment I'm using having stones in your shoes, because you're the one who's hobbling around. The other person is fine, but they're in your shoes and they're fine to begin with, and then they start rubbing, and then more come in, and so it builds up.
I use a variation of that one with it's like holding hot coals with the intention to throw it at someone else. It's you who gets burned. It's similar to those ones.
Exactly. Or taking poison and hoping the other person will die. Yeah, it's all that. And also there's a lot of scientific studies now that are proving how amazing forgiveness is, and all the benefits that it has to your body, including, and right now this is really important, it helps to support your immune system. Because if you're not carrying all those negative feelings inside of your body, and you haven't got that kind of contraction and tension, then your body can function better on the whole, and it lowers cortisol and lowers your blood pressure and all these good things. And it is something that we can do. I mean, in the world at the moment, we might feel very powerless because there's so little that we can actually impact. But what's going on in your own heart is something absolutely in your control. And so you want to do your spring cleaning and getting rid of the resentment. So the other side of the resentment is what it costs you in your sleep, your physical well-being, your other relationships. Because even if you've got like, you're a bit closed off to one person, when you're a bit closed off, it's like whoever the next person is you're still a bit closed off. And if you don't do your healing through your life, you then accrue X relationships and things that happen in your childhood that have not been resolved. And again, that's why I go back to the definition of forgiveness, about feeling a place of peace and resolution and reconciliation in yourself, because you've let all of that go, that you've actually consciously done some work on it. And the fifth one is, how do we forgive? And I think this is another classic one where there's a lot of, well, forgive them. And you're sitting there going, how? because there may be like a meditation where you're visualizing the person, or sending love or something like that, but how do you know you've actually done it? And so my approach comes really from my Catholic tradition, which is to use the principle of confession, where it's a dialogue with a trusted other that you do out loud. So you don't do it with the person you're resenting. You do it with your therapist or with a friend, or, I've even created something online where I can take you through the steps, or, people work with me as well, one-to-one. But so the idea is that you make it a ritual. So especially if it's something significant, if it's like a little thing that's not a really big deal, you can do it yourself when you're out walking, or you can just sit down for 10 minutes and do some forgiveness work yourself. But if it's a significant thing, like, we have this joke where I work on the retreat, if it's not one thing, it's your mother. So I think everyone needs to forgive their parents for not being exactly the way they would like them to have been. That part of the growing up and part of spiritual development and personal development is actually going, and it's not about just justifying. I really recommend, people go, oh, well, I know they were doing the best they can. But the way I do the forgiveness process is you really, truly go back to those early years and really communicate in your imaginary conversation with the person. And so my method is to have an imaginary conversation out loud with the person concerned, and that's how you get that sense of resolution. And you're going backwards and forwards, and there's different steps to it where you're actually taking the position of the other, which is a really important part of the healing process. And then another step where you go higher, which William Ury, who's a peace negotiator, he calls it going to the balcony, where you take a higher perspective and you look down on the stage of your life and at the players, and you're one of the players, and you see, a different perspective, and you take a broader view. And I sometimes say to my clients, it's like going up like Scrooge in the Christmas Carol. He gets taken up by the ghosts of past, present, and future, and then he looks at his life. So it's like that. So I think having a method, having a ritual that you can do, a practice that you can do, is like, that's, to me, that's a mental health practice that everybody should be taught. And that's kind of what I'm on. That's why I'm wanting to talk to as many people as possible at the moment and spread the word, because I do think it's an essential mental and emotional health practice and spiritual practice that we don't recognize, or it's not taught in a way that I think is effective.
Yeah, I think a lot of it just seems to be, not even aware that it is a problem, that it is poisoning our heart and disconnecting us from others, right?
Yeah.
And sort of what you said there was quite interesting about, for as long as we're holding some resentment for some people in our life, it sort of closes us off from new people in our life. And we're sort of carrying that. And I guess it's closely related to trust. If you feel like you've been bitten in the past, you sort of have a problem trusting people that you come into contact with. But yeah, it seems to be like there's a lot of different reasons why forgiveness isn't easy or natural to us. Like you went through those, and probably a lot of that does stem from that ego and that sense of sort of, like you were talking about at the end there, the whole closed perspective sort of thing, right? It's you're very down here on the ground level, just dealing with what's happening, not really taking that bird's eye view, not seeing it from the other's perspective, just sort of seeing it from I'm hurt, my well-being, my pain, and that's all that sort of matters. And I think one of the reasons I love the Brahma Viharas that you said, metta, loving kindness, compassion, it's like that they're born out of that recognition that we all, at our very core, want to be happy, want to be free of pain, but we don't really know how a lot of the time. So many of the things we do that people can hold a grudge for comes from the fact that we were looking for something. We were looking for something better, a bit of pleasure, a bit of happiness, whatever it was. And our intentions, was to find happiness or to avoid pain. It just came out in a really awful way, perhaps. So yeah, it's very interesting. So I guess, so you mentioned one practice there about sort of having this conversation, this visualization. Are there other practices to sort of counter these 5? Do you have maybe a practice for each of the 5, or does this visualization sort of seem to work for all?
The whole I call it forgiveness made easy process is 7 steps. And that is what I recommend, and that's what I teach, and that's what that's the work that I do with my clients. And the one in the book is a slightly simplified version, because when I work with people one-to-one, it takes 90 minutes. But it's a really important, in fact, back to what you were saying earlier, that what's really important is that we do acknowledge the pain. Because I think if you don't acknowledge the pain or the lack of trust or whatever it is, you can't get to the point where you can really truly forgive. It's almost like you have to say that first. You have to say ouch first before and feel like it's been heard, because what I love about doing the imaginary process, not it's an actual process, but the imaginary conversation, is that you feel like, and to your brain, I mean, we know this from sports people, you just visualize yourself practicing and it builds muscle. Or piano, you visualize yourself playing and it builds your finger muscles. I mean, that is extraordinary. So doing this is not insignificant. It's like you've had the conversation, and particularly if someone has died and you felt like you didn't get the chance to say the things you needed to say. And I feel at the moment, with all the COVID deaths, that this is a really important way that people could process what's happened, is to do some forgiveness work on it. And particularly if they weren't allowed to be there at the end of someone's life, or if someone takes their life and then you haven't been able to communicate, and there's always a lot of guilt, and so that, you know, that the combination of all the different feelings that we have that are involved in our forgiveness process all get aired during the first early steps of the process. And when you said something, it is like you are having the conversation that you could never really have in real life, because no one's going to sit there long enough for you to just tell them all the reasons why you resent them, partly because that's to do with you. It's not to do with them. I used to resent my mum for wearing pop socks. Just like, well, they were horrible things, but to her, I mean, that was totally to do with me and my you know, sensibility around what was beautiful and what was not, you know. And so your resentment is so to do with you, which is why it's much better to do it with the equivalent of a priest or your therapist or someone who's, you know, who can handle that. Because a lot of the time when I'm working with people, all I'm listening to is just their grievances. Yeah. But I keep saying, is there anything else? Is there anything else? Is there anything else? Because there's usually more. And then I say, check your back pockets. And then there's, oh, yes, and the other thing they did, you know, and then you've got a whole new kind of like collection of other things. Yeah. And it's really important. And in my experience of having, you know, coached like hundreds of people through their processes, maybe even thousands now, is that unless you do that part, you can't get to the forgiveness part. So it's almost like you have to admit your grievance and you know, you have to basically air all of this, like get your cupboard. You can't clean a cupboard without getting all the stuff out, to get it out first, and then you can move on. So a lot of people, I mean, do spend time ruminating about, you know, the conversation that they wanted to have, or you know, next time I see them, I will tell them this, and this. What would you say is the difference between that sort of unhealthy rumination, in a way, of going over things, and this part of the process? What's different? What's healing about it? So if you do this as part of your forgiveness process, you only need to do it once. I mean, you may still need to go back another time, you know, maybe some years later. So I did some forgiveness work on my mum, like I said, at that time. So she was still alive then. And then a while after that, maybe like 10 years later, and she died by then, I did some more work on her, which was more really about what happened to me when I was even younger. And so there's a sense of, this is a process that you can use whenever you need to use it. And what often happens, like when I say to my clients, do you want your resentment back again? They go, oh no, you know, when they feel like they've dumped it all into the fire, you know, in the process. So there's a real sense that it is a one-way process only. And I think if you're ruminating, it's all going on inside of you. Whereas if you are saying it out loud, you feel like you're communicating it to the other person, and that they're hearing, and then they're able to respond. That's part of the process, is that they actually respond to you. Yeah, interesting. Yeah. I was, this is where I'd like to extend a question to you. That I was teaching a course recently on the Brahma Viharas, the four immeasurables. So we were looking at metta, loving kindness, and compassion. And I was asked a question, which I'm often asked when talking about these, but I'd love to extend it to you and hear your perspective. And the question was about, how can we have loving kindness? How can we have that wish that somebody be well, or have compassion, that, you know, that wish that somebody be free of suffering, for those who we see as truly evil in the world? And I guess it's the same part of that is, how can we forgive those? And the example this person gave was, you know, around terrorists, torturers, and the really evil people in the world. And so, I'd like to extend that question to you. Yeah, well, I have to go back to what I said earlier, which is that forgiveness is not dependent on the extremity of the crime. I also don't believe that anybody is born evil. I really don't think there are any evil babies. I think you learn certain things. You may experience certain traumas in your early life that, you know, maybe predicate your brain towards particular actions. You're going to be enculturated. I mean, if you think about 100-year wars, you must have been taught generation by generation to hate the other side. You can't sustain a war across generations unless you're taught it, you know. So my approach would be the same. The same principles are, if you are resenting people who do hateful things in the world or evil things in the world, what's the benefit to you to hold the grievance? how is your hate helping? This would be a really good example of how is your hate helping? Because then there's just more hate in the world. There's two things you can do. One is you can forgive them. Another one, actually, there's three things. There's another, you can ask, what circumstances would I have had to have experienced in order to do what they're doing? Because that really helps with the compassion. Yeah. And then the other one is, what can I do? You know, if I am absolutely outraged by terrorist acts, what is there something that I can do that will help to change the reality in the world of that? And there may be almost nothing you can do, but for sure, having your heart empty of resentment will be part of that. And this is sort of probably the kind of my nerdy secret, if you like, is that I honestly and truly believe that forgiveness is the key to peace in the world. Because and I had this sort of like epiphany, this was like another part of my journey, which made me write the book in the end, actually, was I had this mapping of Einstein's theory of relativity. So E equals mc squared. So my version was global peace equals forgiveness in every heart times 7 billion. So if everybody did their forgiveness work, there would be peace. I mean, you can't argue with the maths. I mean, you argue that people won't want to, or they can't be bothered, or they don't understand. Or, you know, that is our potential. And so, if that is our potential, then you are asking, so why don't we? And so that kind of like, I think, even if something is an evil act, as we would judge it, it's like not forgiving somebody isn't helping. Changing the law, helping people to be re-educated, creating a world that works for everyone. All of those things need to happen.
Love that answer. That was great.
Yeah.
And yeah, I completely agree. Especially, I think that there seems to be two sort of things there, isn't there? There's the inner approach, which is, you know, what is this actually doing to my heart mind? You know, this is not helping me, and it's also not doing anything for the external thing. You know. And then there's the other approach of sort of like, okay, let's look at this with logic on that external side. You know, what causes a baby to, in the end, as they grow up, become a terrorist? And it's indoctrination, isn't it? It's brainwashing, it's learning, it's conditioning to think that this is how you're going to find your happiness and peace. This is, you know, you've been promised, if you do this, then you'll find whatever you're going to find. And so, yeah, it's really interesting that there's these two sides, isn't there? The internal, the external. Yeah. So I think to just unpack a little bit of what you have been talking about, but I'd like to hear a bit more. You've talked about, you know, why you're passionate about forgiveness, but why would you say that it is essential for our well-being? You started to talk about the physical benefits, but why? You know, what are the physical and the mental benefits of having forgiveness?
Well, I genuinely think it's a master practice along with meditation. And even though I'm a lifelong meditator as well, but you can meditate for decades and never forgive a soul. But equally, excuse me, you can forgive everybody and everything, but never recognize your true nature. So they're not, you know, they're not sort of, they're not exchangeable. They're different practices, and one, you know, can feed the other. Because if you're not ruminating, you know, over all the grievances that you've suffered, then, you know, that doesn't leak into your meditation. But you know, but equally, your meditation practice helps you to have that equanimity and that to be able to hold those. In some ways, it's like holding your own inner terrorist as well. You know, it's like, you know, really that we are one humanity, and we all have the potential to, you know, be any of those things. And so, but the thing with forgiveness is, it's like, it really is a true freedom. And in some ways, it's a freedom of mind, because you are having to look at your meaning making. What have I made this mean? What have I made it mean about me? What have I made it mean about the other person? And it's a you know, cleansing of the heart, because it's about your feeling nature and what, you know, how do I want to be in the world? Do I want to have an open heart? Do I want to let myself be vulnerable and be honest about who I am and what's happened and the you know, what I've suffered, or, you know, and to keep connecting, keep that possibility open, and keep seeing what's really true about other people. the essence of who we all are is the same. We all have that, we're that one consciousness. And just because some people are behaving in a particular way doesn't change that that's their behavior. That's not their true essence. And so the studies about forgiveness, about the physical benefits are, they're obvious and provable. But I think there's a more invisible sense. And I've done this before, where I've done a little forgiveness work, like if I've been going to visit a family member that I haven't seen for a while, or an old friend. And if I do my forgiveness work before I go, they're nicer to me. I have a sweeter time. They're kinder. And of course, that's not really true, but it's like my perception of them, because my resentment isn't in the way anymore, that I've let that go. Then I can feel the connection between other people. And forgiveness, the need for forgiveness is everywhere. And I think a lot of the time it's not even recognizing, even like some people close to me, I say, well, maybe you could do some forgiveness work, and they roll their eyes, obviously, and and say, no, but they just need to be different. They just need to, treat us the way they should.
Holding on to that.
Yeah. And I genuinely believe that you feel lighter and more open-hearted, more joyful, if you're not carrying a load of grievances around in your heart.
Yeah. That sounds similar to the kind of benefits you get from having a meditation practice as well. Just, when you're more in tune with that inner peace, that inner calm, then it seems like other people are kinder or happier, or you have, more of a connection, and it seems better. And half of that is coming from, the fact that your presence is warmer and kinder and calmer, and also you're more in tune to the more positive things that are happening. You started to touch upon that, actually, about your meditation practice. And of course, many of my listeners are meditators, and you lead some workshops and retreats. So I wanted to ask you about a meditation practice, your meditation practice. Where does it fit in? You said that, they're very complementary, but where do you see it fitting in with this practice, if we can call it, of forgiveness?
Yeah. Well, my particular practice of meditation is I studied for about 10 years with Craig Hamilton, who does something called the practice of direct awakening. And so all you're doing is sitting down and practicing being awake as if you were. So you're being aware of awareness and being present as much as you can. And it's a very simple, it's kind of quite sort of Zen practice, actually. And there isn't any other practice in it. There's no compassionate like a Buddhist practice.
Just awareness of awareness.
Yeah. So and but doing that, again, like you're saying, it helps you to not have the interference of all the other parts of human nature. So it's a very pure experience. And also for a while we had a practice where we would co-meditate with each other. And for my experience, this was groundbreaking, because I knew that we were all describing the same place, the same thing that's not a thing. But we were all like if you go into the center of your meditation, the experience that you're having is a universal experience that we all share. We might articulate it slightly differently, but it's this: we were describing or trying to articulate the same thing. And so to me, that was almost like proof that there's some other experience in life that is the mystery that you can't describe and you can't contain. And so for me, having that as it's almost like that's the container in which you would then do your forgiveness work. And so when I'm working with a client, I'm conscious that is their true nature, that all the resentment and stuff that's just in the way. And I've worked with perpetrators as well. People who have done things that we would all call unforgivable. And so it's the same. You hold the same space because that is their true nature, and you hold them with compassion. And the same principle applies, is that holding the resentment, even if they're resenting themselves or feel like they can't forgive themselves. And that's always one of the questions that I get the most, which is about, but what about self-forgiveness? As if it was somehow different. It's exactly the same principles. You're getting something out of it if you're not forgiving yourself. It's an excuse for you to keep beating yourself up. It's hard because getting a bit of distance from yourself, because you're so close, to your own ego, but getting a bit of distance is harder. But apart from that, it's exactly the same. The same shenanigans is going on with your mind. Payoffs and costs are the same. So, yeah.
Yeah. I like this word shenanigans. It works. The shenanigans. I always say the nonsense. It's the same. Yeah, I like it. That sounds that's really insightful, isn't it? That in that meditation practice, you come to recognize that we all, at our core, at our ground of sort of our experience, is that peaceful, calm, luminous state of awareness that we can't really describe, but is it's the ground that we all have, and from that perspective, without the conditioning of body and brain and mind, there's no evil there. There's no it's pure, unencumbered. I think as well, meditation cultivates self-awareness, doesn't it? Especially that practice of just awareness of awareness. And I think probably that self-awareness is essential, maybe to have this kind of mindset shift, to change our perspective, our internal story that we're telling ourselves about the situation, this person, their behaviors, without any sort of self-awareness that that's the story we're telling ourselves. We might not really have the control or the power to be able to change it, right?
Absolutely right on. Because if you can't have that distance from being able to hear your own mind talk or being aware of your own meaning making, then you don't really have anything to say. You're just absolutely believing the story, and not seeing it as a story. And so exactly as you're saying, being able to meditate.
Instant connection, isn't it? With whatever thought comes up, whatever emotion comes up, it's true. It must be believed. Awareness and the thought become the same thing. Yeah. Very interesting. So now I wanted to ask you a question that I'm going to be asking everyone on the podcast. And so if you had just a few minutes to talk to every single person in the world, let's say you had the attention of every ear in the world, and you can tell them just one thing, your top tip that would change their life and why, what would it be? If you could sort of just narrow it into one thing.
A great question, but very challenging. It would be that you can forgive anything, that anything can be forgiven, and that forgiveness is a superpower that you're probably not using in your life, and it's the secret to peace in your heart, in your body, in your mind, between you and other people, and in the world. And my last little bit, I know this is like one thing, is
go ahead.
Your forgiveness is an act of amnesty for all humanity.
I love that. That's amazing. Thank you. Amazing. I wanted to thank you so much. It's been such an interesting conversation, and I'm so grateful, for your time today. So, lastly, where can people find more about you? I think we've talked about your book, Forgiveness Made Easy. Where can people find that? Yeah, so that's all over the internet, also on Amazon and everywhere you can buy books. Although actually, having said that, it's not in bookstores because it's a print-on-demand book. But saves trees, and it's due to be out on audiobook too, which is really exciting. Hopefully, any minute now. And then I also have a website, forgivenessmadeeasy.co.uk. And lovely.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time.
Such a pleasure. Thanks very much.